join with me in welcoming David Chandler to the stage.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for having us across the ditch. And it's always great to return here because it does feel a bit like family, albeit that I didn't start my apprenticeship with Fletcher's. I started with A.W. Edwards back in 1969 as an apprentice carpenter. So it's been a bit of a journey between now and then, but here we are. Well, Pam asked me to share with you some of the journey that we've had in the reform process in New South Wales. I want to get right into it because I think there's a fair bit of material, and hopefully you'll have enough to generate questions, because I'm here to answer your questions as much as I am to just give you a quick overview of where we're at. We set up Building Commission New South Wales on the 1st of December last year. So that's when my Office of Building Commission merged with about 420 staff from Fair Trading, and they now all present themselves as Building Commission New South Wales. We've got a very clear mandate from the Premier. It's different to being just simply a red stick regulator. We're actually to get people to rise up and be the best they possibly can be. So it's about capability and capacity building. And more importantly, it's about making sure that we can deliver the housing that New South Wales needs over the next 10 years. And we need a truckload of housing. So at the centrepiece is build the industry capability and capacity, but at no time compromise the quality that's required to achieve the quantity. Very, very clear message there. Do not compromise on the quality. And a much more expanded mandate than we've had historically, and that is to work across multiple agencies, which a regulator in fair trading never really got to look at because everybody thought they fitted very nicely in a red stick regulator's box and they never came out. So we're out, and we've got a much broader mandate. It's interesting that the things that started the Building Commission in New South Wales, the reforms, was in fact Mascot Towers. Mascot Towers is when 141 apartments were evacuated because of serious structural issues, and it's one of a number of buildings. And the parallel, of course, is your Ridge apartments here. So I was a bit surprised to find that out only just a few weeks back when I was given a link to a particular video that shared the journey of the owners of that building, and in many ways it's just as horrendous as it has been for Mascot Towers owners. Hopefully their misery will come to an end shortly with the government doing a bailout in that space. I don't think there's a bailout here, but we wouldn't want to make it a common practice. So how do you get to this role? People often ask what would be the qualifications to actually be the next Building Commissioner. And the first response is normally you've got big shoes to fill, but the better answer to that is that the next Building Commissioner will bring new shoes, and the interest will be how they fill them. It's quite a different journey because it's been a bit of a battle getting to where we are now. But what prepares you for a journey like this? Well, 50 years in the industry, of course, and really being quite an inquisitive advocate for this industry in every particular facet. But prior to becoming Building Commissioner, I was doing a 3-year sabbatical at Western Sydney University as an adjunct professor. I'd have to tell you, adjunct simply means spare part. Gives you no standing in a university setting at all, but interestingly, we started the Centre for Smart Modern Construction. I went out and raised $650,000 worth of industry money, and did we get some attention? And we actually drove an agenda that is today redefining the construction management program at that university. But of course, on this side of the ditch, I've been privileged to work with Prefab NZ, Pam and all the team here, and to attend and participate in a couple of the collabs here. So it's been very much, my journey has been understanding what's happening over here. And of course, I had a stint as being the most unpopular CEO of Fletcher Challenge and running the international construction operation and taking it out of Penrose and moving it to the AMP building in Bridge Street, Sydney. I think that was probably the biggest mistake they made in appointing me, was to move the office to Sydney. That was not possible to digest it. Anyway, those last couple of years before I took this role on was, in a way, I guess a grounding such that I'd had 3 years to think about really where might this industry go. I had no idea that I was going to be asked to be the Building Commissioner. It was advertised. There were 22 applications. I did not apply. And apparently someone made the decision to reject all applications. I got a call on a Friday afternoon for a cup of coffee, had a cup of coffee, and on Wednesday the following week I'd had 2 interviews and I was signed up for a 2-year program, which is now at almost the end of the 5th year and potentially going into the 6th. Evidence-based decision-making really was the thing that codes you in a university. Opinions are one thing, but data is not disputable. If you've actually got data, then you've got the basis to make sound decisions. So you'll see a little curtsy, Pam, to the work we did with you, and that's down the bottom here. And it was interesting that I've designed a number of research programs for the Building Commission which have really started in the work that we did in New Zealand, having a look at what's the nature of small and medium-sized enterprises. What are the things that define them? What are the things that inhibit them? What do they know about themselves and what don't they know about themselves? Because it's interesting, people beaver away at their business for 10 or 20 years and they really do, I guess, get quite constrained by the vision of their world. So they really see things very much inside their business, and that's what we found with the work we did with CoLab. Most businesses have been in business for more than 10 years. Most businesses would anticipate that the next place they would go to for additional capital to grow their business would be to re-mortgage their family home. So after 10 years of business, the only avenue to new capital is to remortgage your family home. And that is the problem with the construction industry in Australia, and I sense it's an issue here, is that we've never ever quite got out of the fact that this industry is no longer possible to be entered with a mobile phone, a ute and a $2 company. It's a much different industry. It's much more sophisticated. And of course, as we go on the journey into modern methods of construction, people think that you can just simply take the past into the future. You don't. You have to stop and rethink. So one of the things that we wanted to do in New South Wales was to understand the level of digital maturity of the industry. So this particular survey, I'd call it out for you to all go and sort of have a look at it and download, because it really is full of important data. We were looking to see what was the digital maturity of our industry. And of course, what you see is the industry quickly shapes itself into apex players and everybody else at the base. And of course, the majority of the people at the base are small to medium-sized enterprises, and that is the nature of the economy that we both have on either side of the Tasman. So you can see as well the journey plotted. You can see that curve in the top right-hand one, which tells you that a lot of companies start out, but they don't get to that 5-year hurdle. They fall in a ditch because they didn't have the proper capital, they didn't have a good business plan, or whatever. And those that survive start to go on the longer journey and swim on the other side of the pond. And we needed to be very clear to the politicians that I was dealing with, was to say, you need to understand that when you call an industry conference and you invite the village, and when you sit everybody down and the minister walks in and sits at the top of the table, and on one side it's Lend-Lease and on the other side it's Multiplex, and all of the small to medium-sized enterprises are down the other end of the table, and they feel completely disenfranchised because that apex only represents a very small part of our industry. And we've got to start to engage with the people that really count in our industry, because they're the people that are going to ultimately define its future. I don't believe that some of the tier 1 companies today will define this industry's future, because I think they're really locked into what they've done for the last 20, 30, 50 years. And for you to come and suggest to them that they might need to think about different ways of doing stuff, it just does not fit into their business model. It does not fit into their culture. So I'm going to invest my time in what do we do with small to medium-sized enterprises. I thought it'd be good to reflect on a couple of things that I've had to give some thought to over the last couple of years. I've always taken the view that if you're going to do something, Only do it if you can be authentic. Only do it if you can actually talk right across everybody's stakeholders. You can talk with everybody. Don't do anything that you're not prepared to put on a piece of paper on day one and say, when we get there, this is what it's going to look like. So on the right-hand side, that has been what it's going to look like since 2019. That slide has not changed one bit since 2019. Top of the list was that New South Wales is a preferred state for purchasers to invest in a new apartment, because when I came on board, the focus was Class 2 apartment buildings. But of course, my mandates subsequently be extended into Class 1, which is attached and detached housing, Class 3 and Class 9C, boarding houses and aged care dwellings. And people ask, well, why hasn't the Commission got a broader mandate across all types of buildings? Well, at the end of the day, we're governing a building space where unsophisticated purchasers actually invest their time and their lives. A shopping centre is produced by a sophisticated client who really ought to know their way through the traps. You don't see office buildings falling down. You don't see warehouses falling down. So the important focus for us has been where people sleep at night, that's where we are regulating. And we see the world through their lens, primarily. And you can see the list moves down, and I'll talk to you about a few things that have happened along the way. But I just wanted to touch on the two images on the side of this. Because, you know, you learn a lot from history. Troy is a really interesting story. It's about how that city was overtaken. And the strategy was to really find what was the weakest point of entry. How do we get in through the weakest point of entry and then take control? Well, of course, you know, they all dragged the donkey in, and they were all inside the donkey, and that's how Troy fell over. I've used that strategy very successfully, because at the university, I noticed that the dean had bars on his door every time an academic came down to ask for money, because they came with nothing other than the begging bowl. And so I got inside having a chat with him. He said, David, I'm so sick of this. All these guys ever do is ask for money. So when I came back with my $650,000, the door opened and in I went, and we've changed the academic content for that university ever since. So you'll see that the strategy of finding the weakest point of entry and focus on the weakest point of entry and then build from there might be a helpful thing for others. And of course, the other thing I've had to face into is understanding the prism of a regulator. I've never been a regulator. In fact, when I was appointed, most of the consumers said, bloody industry's been successful in getting one of their people in the centre of the tent, the fox in the hen house. And of course, that's proven not to be the case, and those people who were of that view have certainly changed their minds. But it has been interesting to study things like the character of harms. I know that sounds like a really boring read, but I can tell you it's very interesting because it makes you think. And what it's made me think about is the fact that we've spent the last 5 years working on the failed harms and regulations of the last 20 years. But wouldn't it be just dull if we got to the end of this reform and not imagine what are the harms that are coming over the fence? You know, what's happening as we move into modular? What's happening as buildings get smarter? What happens when buildings start to make decisions about their occupants? We live in a global economy. So what happens when the chain of custody is broken and you don't know what's going in? So the character of harms requires you to be a bit more thought conscious of the role of a regulator and understand exactly what that particular responsibility is, because while the public don't think about it, they expect that regulators make their world safe, protect them from harms, protect them from the dodgy players. So I thought this slide would be of interest to you because, in fact, I had to take a slide into my interview on the Tuesday after the coffee on Friday to say, well, if you were thrown the challenge, David, what would you do? So I simply spoke to nominally these 4 images. So in the top left-hand side, you can see that I made a gut call because I didn't have evidence, but I had a pretty good idea that potentially 60% of the players probably were okay. 20% would go either way if you took your eye off them. And there were 20% of bad guys. And I think that's still the case. So I think we've made a lot of progress. But what we've tried to do is to work out, well, if you knew that you could separate the yolks from the whites, what would you do about that? So we've progressively moved to how do you create industry-led trust-based solutions like iCert and 10-year warranty insurance so that you can actually impregnate the trustworthy with those sort of consumer-facing benefits. And for a regulator, it allows you to start to think about taking your pedal off the whole of the industry and concentrate scarce public resources into a place where you can be most useful to mankind. So that's what we've done. But the other thing is back to Troy. Because when I was appointed, the industry came out and said, oh, if it wasn't for mascot towers and opal towers, you would not need a building commissioner. Well, we've disabused them of that particular error. But notwithstanding, if I'd have said, I'm going to have an assault on all of you and you're all going to learn new dance steps, A, I couldn't have done it, and B, I would have had a fight on my hands of a proportion that would not be viable. So I worked out, I actually got permission to go and kick the living daylights out of the worst 20%. And everybody on the other side said, that's exactly right, Commissioner. Focus on them because they're the bad guys. They didn't realise that when we got inside the walls of the village, that some of these people on the right were as mixed up in the stuff on the left as they surprisingly came to find. So then in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see on the left-hand side of that diagram was where the 400 odd fair trading resources spent most of their effort. In the 3 to 10 years after a building was built, they responded to complaints. And of course the horses bolted at that point. Try to put the genie back in the bottle when you've got a really wretched building like Mascot Towers is impossible. So in the last 5 years, the entire effort of fair trading has flipped, and now 80% of the effort is spent before buildings are finished. We intervene from the day that someone puts a line on a piece of paper to imagine a building, to declare the designs, to declare the as-builts, and ultimately declare that the building has been built in accordance with those designs. Now, on the bottom right-hand side was another piece of disabuse to politicians who thought, legislation, I've done that, all fixed. Stuff's not fixed with legislation. Stuff's fixed when you actually get everybody to want to go in the same direction. So you need to have much more in your kit than just simply a pocket full of laws, because a pocket full of laws is absolutely no value at all. So we created a Construct New South Wales strategy with 6 pillars in it. First pillar, of course, was the legislation. Second pillar was starting to look at how do we distinguish between trusty and risky. The third was to look at what sort of learning capabilities, where were the gaps in knowledge. The fourth started to look at what were the fault lines in the transactions between the parties. The fifth started to look at the digital space as to where we were up to, what we needed to do. And finally, the sixth space was all about research. And I remember going to the first budget and fronting up and saying, I've got some money here for research. And the people in the Treasury office went, nah, cross that out. You don't need that. That's a nice to have. And I said, well, if we're not having that, we may as well not start the journey, because if we don't have evidence basis to make decisions, then we'll make the wrong decisions. So you either put that money back in or find someone else to do this job. Well, the money went back in, and research has become now a very, very important and recognised part of our work. So we continue to do some very important pieces of research. And in the top right-hand corner is an example of how you can steal. I'm a thief, so I don't really invent much because I'm not that smart. But I was interested in that Gartner hype cycle, which was a sort of diagram that showed you what everybody expects new technology will do. Oh, once we've got AI, we're going to be able to do this, we're going to do that. And of course you go on this hype cycle where you go through this period of great expectation and hope, and then you end up in the trough of disillusionment. And that's what was happening in New South Wales. The politicians just did not understand that the industry was in a trough of disillusionment and they had to get out of that. And that's why we needed a very broadly based strategy. But we did need to give some prospect as to what it was going to look like. So one of the very bold and early calls was that I would attempt to get the insurers back in the market by 2023. And I can tell you that the first of the 10-year warranty insurance policies were issued in New South Wales during 2023, and the first 10 buildings now have been finished with a 10-year warranty insurance. There's currently 50 starting, and by 2028 it won't be an optional product offering by developers, it will be embedded in legislation and they'll have to offer it. But we needed a situation where you could build the market rather than just simply say today we don't have it, tomorrow we're going to have it. We had to work with the insurance industry to make a product like that possible. Sorry, how do I go back one? That's it. Is that it? Have I gone the wrong way? Yeah. I just really want to touch on this. This is really starting to look out what's coming up, and I just would like you to look at the two diagrams. The red line is the expected number of apartments that would be built in New South Wales out to 2030. And a new concept for a public regulator or a public agency is that we've started to talk about what does peak regulator look like, because we simply can't expand a public regulator simply because the market got bigger. We've just simply got to work out how do we be as effective and smart when the market's getting bigger, when you know it's going to get bigger, and you have a responsibility to be very careful in spending public money. So you'll see on the left-hand side, that bottom part under the dark blue line is that's where I'm making a call that by 2025 in New South Wales, Building Commission, New South Wales will have hit what I call peak regulator. We won't need any more people to regulate the building industry in New South Wales. But how do we backfill it? Well, above that blue line is what we would call market-led solutions. ICERT, 10-year warranty insurance, professional standard schemes, and a range of other things that are elastic. Those things can be as big as the market is. So the regulator will become inelastic, and what the industry can do will be totally elastic. And that's how we're going to make sure that we regulate across an ever-expanding market and deliver what people are expecting. Again, back to research. This is the second strata survey that we did. We did the first one in 2021. We did one last year. And we wanted to know what were strata communities feeling about the change. Was there a change? Were they feeling different? Were they starting to feel more confident? And we had some pretty horrible, I guess, realities to face into, because when we first did the survey in 2021, the strata communities told us that 39% of buildings had one or more serious defects in them. Now, at that time, they really didn't trust the regulator, and I reckon we were only getting part of the story. And second of all, they didn't understand the difference between serious defects in the common property of buildings as opposed to what I would call consumer defects in their own lots. And really what we're about regulating is, in fact, the importance of the common property, the key building elements in the common property, the structure, the waterproofing, the building services, those sorts of things, not simply a scratch on a bench top. That's a consumer matter. We're really very less exercised on that than we would be. But you can see that from 2020, when the first of the new legislation came in, first of all the RAB Act, followed then by the DBP Act, you can start to see that the red boxes start to shrink. On the second survey, the 39% went up to a peak of 63%, settled at about 56%, and then we've started to see a gradual decline in observed serious defects in the common property by owners' corporations. Now, the data sets are still a bit thin at that end. So I take a view that one swallow does not a summer make. So we're going to watch that, and we'll do it again next year just to see how it's travelling. But I can tell you that on the far right-hand side, at the bottom you can see what our field audit team saw in 2021. So that's the people out there exercising the RAB Act and what they saw. And you can see, for example, in waterproofing, it was off the Richter scale. They were seeing it everywhere. We pulled out over 1,000 bathrooms in New South Wales, much to the distress of some developers, but suck it up. But we did that. We had a look at that data again with our most recent survey data, and look how much the waterproofing incidence has come back. And now we would probably call passive fire as being the biggest emerging risk in New South Wales right now. So I think we've made some progress. We've got a lot to do, but we've got to be really careful that we don't drink our own Kool-Aid, because that's a big mistake if you think job's done and that you can just say, well, there's your evidence and I'm leaving. That's not. We've got a massive amount of work to do. So enter Building Commission New South Wales. Well, we couldn't run the same strategy we ran for the Office of Building Commissioner, which had a completely different mandate. Office of Building Commission was all about working with and advising the Minister, working and advising the Secretary, because I had no line management in fair trading, about what reform looked like, how could we improve the regulator, and then most importantly, winning the hearts and mind of the industry and getting the industry want to get off this race to the bottom and start to think about what the race to the top might look like. So that's what we spent the first 3 or 4 years doing, but now we've got a much more serious proposition on our hands. What do we look like for the next 10 years? So we now have developed a very clear strategy about how we're going to do that. So I'll just touch on the right-hand wheel. We were having a competition as to what we would call it. Someone stupidly suggested a frisbee, but we've decided we won't use that. But it is the Building Commission's strategy. And so you can see there's 4 moving parts in that strategy. There's the data and intelligence piece. Where are the risky players? Where can we best attend projects and land on the most risky? The next piece is then if you know where they are, then you can set a rolling 3-month agenda for this inspectorate. So our inspectorate are required to dig into that advice from the intelligence and analytics people about where all of the possibilities for problems might be, and report on inspections and feed the inspections into an enforcement space, and then feed enforcements into licensing. For the first time in New South Wales, we have all of that process now as a continuum. I can tell you that the data analytics team draw on a store of data points. They believe it's in the order of 3 billion data points. They hold the second largest data asset to the Defence Department in Australia. And I still get met by these donkeys on these sites when they're picked for an audit and they say, how did you pick me? And you go, well, you just wonder. Duh. Do you know the people in our analytics department are nerds? Geez, everyone should have nerds like this. Because these guys actually say, well, we wanted to predict that you'll find at least 3 serious defects on the jobs we put at the highest risk. And they got to a 90% success rate in picking those jobs for us. And so they're now back working on how they can make it at least 5 serious defects, because that's what keeps them up at night. I'm so glad. We've introduced new requirements for the registration of design professionals and building practitioners, and we had to allow a lot of people in the first time because new legislation, we couldn't stop the industry dead, so there was a grace period where till February 21 pretty well just everybody had to fill out their application to be these people and declare that they actually had a legitimate basis for that registration. This time round there'll be a filter, and I can assure you there'll be quite a large number flicked out of that ring. But that'll all be evidence-based, and we'll thin out the ranks a little bit, but we've now managed to get everybody to realise that to be a registered design practitioner in New South Wales is a badge of honour. Wear it proudly and make sure you stand up for what it means. And if you're a registered building practitioner in our industry in New South Wales, please understand that you live in a digital age and that everything you do today, tomorrow and the next day, a little digital dwarf will sit on your shoulder for the rest of your living life. And it will record everything you do, good, bad and ugly. It'll be up there. You want to get to know your digital twin because it will follow you forever, particularly in New South Wales, because we're getting really, really good at it. So here's another challenge that we had to confront, and that was all of the other states decided that the best way to turn the industry around was to have an attack on the trades. The waterproofers, the electricians, the plasterers, the tilers. They're the bad guys. They're the guys that have got crappy licences. They're the guys that are doing bad work. And I stood back and looked at all of that and I thought, well, after all of these years of trying to pound away at these poor buggers, you've made no difference at all because we're still making bad buildings. So then I had the developers coming and seeing me with crocodile tears and saying, "Oh, Commissioner, you can't get a good bricklayer anymore. You can't get a good tiler." I said, but the problem is that you don't know because you've never looked for them. You've always looked for the crappiest person you can beat the living hell out of to give you the lowest price to do what you think you can get away with. Don't tell me there aren't good quality trades out there because I'm sure this industry is abundant with people who want to do good work and actually have the skills to do it. So the good developers have no trouble finding these trades. It's the people like Top Place, Murhi, Raylan, Dildam. They always scrape the bottom of the barrel to see what they could come up with so that they could get away with the least possible inputs that they'd ever been able to have to put in the business. So when you stand back and you think, well, what's the Troy bit of this? And you realise that really the most important thing in off-the-plan sales of apartment buildings, because that's what most of the sales are around, is that fundamental contract between the developer and the purchaser. That is the primal agreement here. An unsophisticated purchaser says to a sophisticated developer, "I've got no idea what you guys do, but I'm going to put my trust in you to deliver me a trustworthy building." That is the primary engagement arrangement. And that's where we focused all of our legislation in New South Wales, to focus on the Design and Building Practitioners Act and the Residential Apartment Buildings Act that holds the developer solely and personally accountable for the buildings they're making. And guess what? Life's changing for designers and trade contractors. I had one waterproofing contractor tell me that he's on a job where he was so busy, he said to the developer, "Mate, I'm sorry I won't be able to get to you this year." And the guy begged him to come. He said, and when he turned up, he actually came down and opened my car door and welcomed me to the job. I said, how fresh is that to think about it? But you know, the message to these developers is this. You take on this responsibility to deliver a trustworthy building to a consumer. Now, from that point on, you make the big decisions. You decide who the designers are. You pick the designers. You pick the builder and you pick the certifier. And you can make good choices or bad choices. And if you make bad choices in New South Wales going forward, we will hang that round your neck. And right now in New South Wales, I've got a building in Wollongong, Crown View Apartments, 220 odd apartments, and it would have been the next Mascot Towers. Now, we first intervened and put a prohibition order on this job in September 21, just after the RAB Act powers came in, because we'd seen a particular array of defects in that building, and they were beavering away on that, and we put a supervisor in there at their expense to oversee what they were doing, and progressively I hear more noise about, Christ, you should hear what they're discovering. So I've now put a second prohibition order on that building a matter of a month ago, and I've put out a building works rectification order on that building, and they'll get another one next week. This building is so bad that I'll now tell you a few bits about it, and I'll bet you we have a collective, oh, bullshit. No way. Right, I'll watch the heads. You watch. So I got the word that the PT on this job is unbelievable. They're up on the 18th floor of this building, having gone and found where the PT cables were and drilled holes up into the PT on every single floor. This is a finished building, by the way. The kitchens, the bathrooms are already done. Sitting that way since the end of 21. And guess what? 80% of the cable ducts weren't grouted. They were full of water, so when they put a drill in them, they had a shower. About 10% of them had no cables in them at all. Watch the heads. See, look. Bullshit, right? Bullshit. No, fact. And it just got worse. So someone thought, well, we better have a look and see where they haven't put steel. And all through the building, there's marks on the floor. No steel here, no steel there. So this building has got more carbon fibre in it than I have ever seen anywhere. So as they were working their way through it, they also realised that the builder got the cable drapes mixed up and actually put the cables at the top in the midspan as opposed to the bottom. So the cables weren't working in the bending moment space. So that's why there was so much carbon fibre going in, because they're trying to compensate for the fact that the cables are doing nothing. It's everywhere. Now, this was a building contract that was worth $54 million. And as of a week ago, they have already spent $37 million on defects repairs. And I wandered down there a week before last and I thought, well, what don't I know about this building? So I thought, oh, I'll go tap, tap, tap on the bathroom tiles because no one's probably had a look there. And guess what? All the bathroom tiles weren't put on properly. Well, they're all going to come out. 250 bathrooms. There was no code mark on any of the glass on the balconies. There were no overflows on the balconies. So how bad would a building get? Now, had the consumers settled on this building in December 2021, they would have had all of those defects hung around their neck because the developer was a man of sand, is a man of sand, and I don't think they'll be there much longer. So on a more positive note, the message to rebuild the base of this industry is one that is exercising a lot of minds, and I'm hoping today I'll get some views from amongst all of you because this is where we're sitting at the moment. In New South Wales, there'll be a shrinking of the urban edge. We're not going to be going out at the rate we've normally done. So there'll be fewer Class 1 buildings, detached and attached housing, because the land's too expensive and it's too hard and too expensive to drag the public infrastructure, schools, hospitals, sewer, roads out to the urban edge. So it's highly likely that the size of the detached and attached housing market in New South Wales is going to start to shrink. Well, where are all of those players going? They're not going to evaporate, so they've started already to filter into the Class 2 space. And our audits have indicated to us that, in fact, a migrant from Class 1 into Class 2 is, in fact, a highly risky player. Because while they think they know everything in Class 1, question mark, they don't know much about Class 2. So when you actually take them away from starting a job slab on grade to slab on suspended slab, they've never seen a beast like that before and they struggle. So I won't go into unpacking that any more than that, other than to say, here is where Building Commissioner New South Wales is going to, is going to put most of its effort in the next year. So this is my last slide, I think, because I really want to make sure we've got time for proper engagement. But we stood back and looked at the industry and said, well, from the digital survey, we know that the apex is actually fairly thinly populated by number. We think there's probably only 20 to 50 players in the apex. And in Tier 2, there could be 100 or 200. In Tier 3, there's thousands. So we then looked at, well, what are the things that we should think about, because we want to be very strategic about what we play here and where we play. is that I can tell you that for T1 and T2, 70% of those players today have an iCert rating. So I feel more confident about those people than I would have at the start of this journey. They've got demonstrated credential that they're committed to being in the industry. They've got the financial capability to play. They're not all accident proof, but they're largely going to be that way. So 70% of the Tier 1 and Tier 2 players in New South Wales are rated. And some players who would never have got a rating in that space, no longer in business. Top Place, Murhi, Raylan, BuildUP, and others, and a structural engineer called Ace Engineering, who were collectively responsible for about 2,000 apartments a year with serious defects in them. They're gone. Not in the naughty corner, they're just gone. And they're not going to return. So the top part of the industry is looking a lot better than it did 4 years ago. But we've got a problem in the Tier 2, 3 space because there's hardly anyone there that's rated. So, and we've got this class coming from Class 1 into Class 2, and they've really only got trainer wheels on them. And so when you look at what sort of buildings they build, well, the Class 1, the Tier 1s, the volume that they tend to produce is between 5,000 and 3,000 apartments a year. They're big, sophisticated players, and these days they really sell into the top end of the market because they're the premium players, the Lend Leases and the Mirvacs, others. And their typical construction cost for the product they're building these days is up around $8,000 a square metre, because their retail prices are north of $18,000 a square metre, heading towards $25,000 a square metre. And that ain't affordable. But we've got the old IBM problem that we had back in the 80s. No public servant ever got the sack for buying an IBM computer, albeit it was 4 times the cost of everything else. So we can't sleepwalk into that. The Tier 2 developers do somewhere between 200 and 500 apartments a year, and their cost of construction is about $6,000 a square metre. Their retail prices are sitting somewhere around $12,000 to $18,000 a square metre. Still bloody expensive and really challenging people to get a foot on a piece of real estate. But the very good players in the Tier 3 space are holding on to the fact that they can produce at about $4,000 a square metre, about the same cost as the job we were out on yesterday. And I'm holding $4,000 to $6,000 as the holy grail of the next generation of constructors in New South Wales. So we have got a strategy called Build It New South Wales. Does it have one piece of exertion that will be applied to a Tier 1 or Tier 2 player? Absolutely not one exertion at all. Because what we want to do is to see how can we create the next wave of capable, competent, innovative constructors who know what staying on the rails looks like, but who can do more innovative things than these people in Tier 1 and Tier 2 are so wedded to doing things the way they've always done them that their costs will always be their costs. And I think we've got a real opportunity here to think this through. And so we've started our work on that space. And we'll focus on typically 3 to 4 stories, but ultimately up to 10 as we bring these people across. Now, who are the people we most want to get to? There are over 20,000 house builders registered in Class 1 in New South Wales. And they're run by proprietors that are all post any form of learning of at least 10 to 15 years. They're 10 to 15 years out from when they last did anything in the learning space. And they think they know it because they just hung around long enough. And they've been doing what they've always done, and unfortunately that's not necessarily a licence to keep doing it that way. Of course, governments have been slack in investing in TAFE and universities, and that's true too. But anybody who graduates from a university or TAFE today will be at least 10 years before they're in a position of influence in any enterprise. So who are the people who are in positions of influence, and how do we get hold of them? So Build It New South Wales is going to target 1,000 people who have been in the industry for more than 10 years, and see what we can do to provide micro-learning capability builds for them to bring them into the 21st century and into a building capability that we need them to have. We set ourselves a goal that 30% of those 1,000 will be women, 5% of them will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, and we'll struggle to meet all those hurdles. But our goal is to try and bring 1,000 of these Class 1 people into this space by 2030. Now that's ambitious, and I'm sure we'll be a bit slow out of the blocks, but I can assure you that by 2030 we'll be well on the way, because our learning module process in OBC has been amazing. The number of courses that have been enrolled and completed are staggering, and we are creating product that people want to do and actually post on LinkedIn when they actually get a certificate for having achieved one of the modules. So we've got people wanting to wear recognition of new insights and abilities as a badge of honour, whereas 5 years ago people said, who gives a rat's ass? So there you go. So that's a bit of the insights into what's happening in New South Wales. There's a long way to go, but hopefully that's helpful to you. Thank you.
So if you've got questions, the best way is actually to put them onto Slido. I will respond to waving arms, but I'll just probably assume you're drowning. There we go. We have a question, yes?
Both countries have performance-based building codes. What does your research say about the contribution of performance-based building codes to building failure?
It's left me very sceptical, to be honest with you, because what I've seen in the last 4 years is a demonstration that the yellow pages is long enough, and if you keep going down the list, you'll find someone that'll tell you what you want to hear as opposed to what you need to hear. So we're disabusing people of saying, why don't you just do it the right way the first time? Think about doing it the right way the first time, and you won't need to have some of these alternatives, because I haven't seen a lot of joy in that space. I know it solves some very complex problems. I mean, here's an example of one. I'm dealing with a project at the moment where they got a planning consent and it's in a flood area for a block of apartments. Now, that's a planning decision, but I'm now at a point where I've got this building coming up for occupancy. And as I drove past it last week, in the planning process, they'd gone and got an expert to say, oh, we've got a flood mitigation strategy. I think the strategy was no more than put a high watermark on the outside of the building such that it can be 2.1 metres underwater. 3 basements below there, switchboard room, fire pump room, and not to mention what would be the first responders, where would they stand to try and get people out of that building? So I'm a bit sceptical about shopping down the yellow pages, so I've actually chucked the yellow pages out for a while.
Thank you, David. We've got a question here. How is the golden triangle of cost, time and quality treated differently in New South Wales, where cost seems to reign supreme in New Zealand? It's a question I'll ask of the panel when they come back, but I'm interested in how that works in New South Wales.
Well, it's been the wicked problem that's always been the debate of my construction career, and it's only in recent times in this role that I've sort of come to terms with it. The fact is that all of them are equal and you can't have one without the other. But if you only have one, go for quality, because if you actually have quality, you get time and cost as a reward. So what the evidence of that is now, under the DBP Act, that requires you to have declared designs before you start construction. I'm now getting designers saying, hey, guess what? We're getting to mature design much quicker, but the builders are saying, hey, isn't it great that we've actually got a kit of mature, ready to construct documentation? Guess what? We're going to expect lower rework. We expect that we can plan a faster construction time. And if you follow Procore's data, it indicates that up to 12% of construction costs these days is spent on rework. So I'm starting to people say there's a dividend of the reforms in New South Wales. So focusing on quality, you actually will get time and cost as a dividend.
Thank you. Tom here has a question. What percentage of critical defects occur within the first 10 years post-PC project completion?
Look, most defects will present within the first 5 years. Certainly waterproofing presents quicker than that, about 2 years I would think, because bathrooms take a little bit of time to the walls to get saturated, and then the impact of saturated walls starts to permeate. So I would reckon between 2 and 5 years you'd see the majority of the defects. But, you know, when you've got serious structural defects like this wreck down in Wollongong, you're probably going to have to put monitoring on that for 20 years just to see where it's going. So this is the dilemma I've got, is to, well, how would I lift a prohibition order on that? But I've already got one building where we have required monitoring, and the developer had to put an $11 million bond in to attend to anything that presents from the monitoring over the first 10 years of the life of the job. Now, that's unprecedented, but we're going to see more and more of that. If you don't build it right, you can argue that it'll probably be all right, but if you want to make that argument, you'll have to put some dollars on the table.
Thank you. I've got two questions here I'm going to combine, but they're very similar. One, I'll read them both out. One is, what are the specific law changes you've made in the last 4 years? And the other question, what's the single most impactful for better building quality legislation move taken by NSW? So what specific law changes and most impactful?
Well, certainly the RAB Act was a foundation piece.
And can you, RAB?
The Residential Apartment Buildings Compliance and Enforcement Powers Act. Is that, we call it the RAB Act, it's easier.
Thank you.
But, sorry.
Just for the sake for
Sure.
the ministerial people in the room, they need to write this down. The lawmakers are here.
Okay. So that came as a result of me being taken by fire and rescue out to a project at Auburn, which... Now, I've lived in the privileged world of being a Tier 1 builder all of my life. I have never seen some of the stuff that I've seen. In fact, I've sent young cadets out from Hanson Yunkin to look at some of this stuff, and they've come back shaken that one human could actually do that to another human. So I came back and spoke to the Minister in October, November 2019, and I said, Minister, if I don't get some immediate powers to make a difference, I may as well go back and go fishing. He said, no, you're not going to do that. So what powers do you want? Well, I said, I want the powers to issue stop work orders, prohibition orders, which means you can't get an occupation certificate, and building works rectification orders. So those three elements of that were really the corners of those powers. And furthermore, I want to be able to make those orders on my reasonable opinion, not at a level where I have to go to the court and get the court to give me approval to issue the order, where I've just got to simply form a view that on balance, the public interest is served better by me issuing the order than not issuing the order. Now, developers have the right then to go to the Land and Environment Court in New South Wales and challenge my order, but until such time as a judge puts their order in place of my order stays. And I've tried to write all my orders in a way where a reasonable judge would have the same process of thinking that I have, and that is, I make this order bearing in mind the pleadings made to me by the developer about the economic and disruptive costs of complying with the order, as opposed to the potential hazard that we would be putting consumers in this building, and in this instance I've come down on the side of the consumers. Now, I'll challenge any judge to actually think through that. But we've only had 2 or 3 challenges out of hundreds of orders. We've lost one. Well, sorry, we didn't lose it. We actually withdrew it. I'll come back to that. And we won 2. The one that we withdrew was because the legislation was immature, and it was a basement issue in the Class 10 part of the building, and we didn't have that covered in my powers. So I just went straight back to the Minister and said, hey, we missed that out of the ledge. And 6 weeks later, they'd put new regs through and basically was added into the legislation, and we went back and reissued the order and said, yeah, get on and fix it. So I think the RAB Act was a game changer. And in a way, the opposition was really pushing hard against the government at the time, and they were suspicious and they weren't confident. So they were giving the government hell over the Designer Building Practitioners Act, the DBP Act. And so they actually kicked it down the way a bit and wanted to fiddle with it. And it was being over-tampered with by all sorts of interests, particularly lawyers who actually managed to put their fangs in owners' corporations' necks and suck for years before they let go after they've achieved nothing other than sucking hundreds of thousands of dollars out of owners' corporations. So we've managed to convince the legislators that maybe stop being attracted to the pleadings of lawyers, because I'm telling them to start taking their kids out of private schools, because they are a problem. So we were having trouble with the DBP Act, and it was interesting. The Minister said, let's do the RAB Act. The Minister said, we'll do that in November 19. It was tabled in the House in the first week of February 2020, and it went through the Parliament on the 8th of June, and it was stood up on the 1st of September. It is an unprecedented passage of new legislation, greenfields legislation, and there was not one dissension on either side of the House. It got 100% of every politician. That was a defining moment.
Quite an achievement. Another question here about how are you identifying your risky developers, builders?
Well, apart from having an extraordinary set of data, what we look for, the most telling indicator is that they've got a long list of safe work improvement notices. Anybody who has a reckless attitude to safety on site will have no regard for compliance in the building codes. It's a 100% joined at the hip type problem. So the first data set that we look for is, what is the history of this building company in terms of its safe work record? Red flag. Who is the certifier on this job? So we go and look at the history of projects certified by a particular certifier. Red flag, if we've got a certifier of that nature. What are the complaints history at fair trading about these players? Well, that's another red flag. One of the challenges we had with complaints is that in the first strata survey, only 15% of owners' corporations felt confident to report their defects to fair trading. So we didn't see 85% of the players. In the last survey, that's now up to 34%. I'm hoping we can have it up around 60% the next time. So, you know, we've had to build trust, and the more trust you get, the more insight you get into where the risky players are. So we're compiling that in a way that is unprecedented. We can pretty well tell every developer who their candlestick maker is. I guess a funny anecdote is that before I go onto a project, I get a project of interest report from our intelligent people. So it tells me about, does this person carry a gun? Because I've got a responsibility before I take officers into a project to know whether the person that's in charge of the business carries a gun. Well, I can tell you that on a number of these, it's got warning, no one to carry a gun. So I can't tell anybody that. That's for me to know, and I've then got to have a step-down strategy when I take people into a job, and that's what our other officers do. But on this particular project of interest report, it said the director of this company impersonates policemen. So when I go on jobs, quite often a number of people turn up to 15 or so, and it's sort of like a grand round in a hospital, and they all follow you around like people are going, oh, gee, wow, stuff they should know. So I had these 15-odd people standing in front of me, and I said to them, oh, by the way, who amongst all of you impersonates policemen? And I go, was it you? Oh, no, Commissioner. I went right down the line. Oh, no, Commissioner. I said, well, guess what? One of you do, and I know who you are. So let's get on with the inspection. Well, I saw that person crumble in the line. Fantastic stuff.
I'm just, here's we're about to bring our panel up to the stage, but before we do that, the last question on Slido for the moment is the New South Wales infrastructure pipeline appears to have stalled since mid-last year. Any lessons for New Zealand to avoid a similar fate following a change of government?
Well, fortunately, I'm not in the Ministry for Planning. I'm in the regulation side of things, so I don't have to deal with that, and I'm also not responsible for infrastructure. But my personal observation is that governments have been at the mercy of Class 1 house building sector for so long that the only way to get everybody into housing is to keep dragging the urban edge out. And this government in New South Wales decided that's folly. We can't keep dragging the urban edge out because we just can't drag the infrastructure, A, fast enough, and B, we can't afford it. So expect to see the demand for that infrastructure come down a bit. But I think we ended up with the urban edge got too far ahead of the infrastructure. And I know that in one part of southwest Sydney, there's over 200 homes that got a subdivision plan registered where the developer entered into a 5-year sewer pumping agreement because the sewer hadn't got to that 200 homes, and he's undertaken to pump the sewer over the hill for 5 years. I just hope he doesn't go broke in that period of time, but the good thing is councils have pushed back and said, hey, no, we're not doing that anymore. Can you imagine living in a house where the developer had signed up a 5-year sewer pumping agreement just to pump it over the hill till Sydney Water caught up with it? So look, they're the challenges, and I think the government's really facing into them quite well.
Thank you. You've given us much to think about. David's going to remain on stage while the productivity panel joins us, but before I invite them up, I just want you all to join me in giving David a warm thanks for his